Hello everybody and welcome to my Phyrexia All Will Be One draft guide. In this video, I will be giving you all the information you need to find success in the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, I'll go over the top commons, I will provide archetype overviews, I'll show you the combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Starting with the set mechanics, they are Toxic, Corrupted, 4 Mirrodin, Oil counters, and Proliferate. Toxic is a new mechanic that will give your opponent poison counters when your creature deals combat damage. The number of poison counters is equal to the toxic number. For example, Toxic 2 on Branch Blight Stalker. And when your opponent has 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. Corrupted is a reward for giving your opponent poison counters for if they have 3 or more poison, and it will make your cards better. For example, Fleshless Gladiator gets an extra ability when Corrupted is enabled. 4 Mirrodin is a keyword found on equipments that will have the equipment come into play attached to a 2/2 Rebel creature token. Oil counters are a new type of counter that will come into play on creatures or artifacts, and then you can use those counters for various things. For example, Axiom Engraver can tap, remove an oil counter to have you discard a card and draw a card. And then the final mechanic is Proliferate, which lets you choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So you can proliferate poison counters, +1/+1 counters, oil counters, and anything like that. Moving on to the top commons, starting with white. At number 1 is Basilica Shepherd. It's 3 creatures for 1 card, including a 3/3 flyer, all for just 5 mana, which is a really nice top-end threat for any white deck. At number 2 is Planar Disruption, an efficient removal spell for white. And then at number 3 is Charge of the Mites, which is both a removal spell and also a way to build up your board state depending on whether you have creatures or you need creatures. So it comes in at number 3. Next up is blue, and at number 1 is Mesmerizing Dose. It's a nice removal option for blue decks and also has Proliferate, which is quite powerful. At number 2 is Quicksilver Fisher, a great top-end flyer that gives you a little bit of card selection as well. And then at number 3 is Malcator's Watcher, which is a great card to play early, chip in for some damage, and then eventually trade off for some value because it will draw you that card when it dies. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Annihilating Glare. It's a great removal spell because it can either be cast for cheap if you have something to sacrifice to it, or you can cast it for 5 mana later in the game and will be able to kill anything you care about. At number 2 is Anoint with Affliction, which is a great removal spell, especially if you're going to be enabling Corrupted at some point in the game, because if you're killing anything for 2 mana, it's very strong, and even killing something that has mana value 3 or less for 2 mana is generally pretty good, especially at instant speed. And then at number 3 is Testament Bearer. It's a pretty solid 4-drop creature that's going to get you a good amount of value when it dies, which is just a nice card to round out your black decks. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Volt Charge. 3 mana, deal 3 at instant speed, and Proliferate is just a fantastic card, and one you're going to want to take aggressively. At number 2 is Hex Gold Slash, another excellent red removal spell. 1 mana to deal 2 damage is already pretty solid, and if you're dealing 4 damage, then that is just incredible efficiency. And then at number 3 is Furnace Strider, the perfect card to top off your aggressive red deck's curve, because not only is it going to be able to use its oil counters to come in with haste itself, but it's also going to be able to threaten giving any of your other creatures haste, which just makes your opponent in a very scary position. So Furnace Strider comes in at number 3. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Contagious Vorak. 3 mana for a 3/3 is a reasonable stat line, and the fact that it's going to get you a land when you need one, or proliferate, is really nice upside as well. At number 2 is Ruthless Predation, a great fight spell for green that's going to boost the stats of your creature and take out something on the other side of the board. And then at number 3 is Lattice Blade Mantis, which essentially reads as a 4 mana 5/4 Vigilance, which is just a huge stats monster that is going to be a problem for your opponents. Moving to the color rankings, it's first worth noting that color rankings are more of a tiebreaker. You shouldn't be forcing a color or avoiding a color, but if you have a close pick, at number 1 is red, number 2 is blue, number 3 is green, number 4 is white, and then black is coming in at number 5, though they are all pretty close. Moving on to the archetype overview, starting things off with red-white, which is a 4 Mirrodin equipment-themed deck. You will play out as a normal aggressive deck, but then in the late game, when you would typically run out of things to do with your aggro deck, you'll have all of these equipments lying around, which you'll be able to use to suit up your little creatures and continue attacking your opponent. You have a card like Bladehold Warwhip, which makes it easier to equip your cards and also gives equipped creature double strike. You have Hexgold Halberd, which is a way to give your creature first strike and trample. And then Hexgold Hoverwings is great in this deck because not only does it give the equipped creature flying, it gives all creatures you have that are equipped +1/+0. Next up is Blue-Black, which is a Proliferate control deck. So you'll leverage card advantage, removal, and also synergy with the Proliferate mechanic. For example, Voidwing Hybrid can be a nice efficient flyer early in the game, and then whenever you proliferate, you get to bring it back from your graveyard to your hand. Thrumming Bird is a great way to trigger your Proliferate synergies, and Scheming Aspirant is an early drop that can keep your life total high and slowly kill your opponent as you proliferate. Green-White is a toxic aggro deck, which will leverage efficient creatures to beat down your opponent before they can stabilize. You have Slaughter Singer, which has Toxic 2, so it really packs a punch, and whenever another creature with Toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, so it really boosts your other creatures. You also get access to a card like Venomous Brutalizer, which has Toxic 3, which is absolutely huge, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you can start to proliferate, so you can even start proliferating toxic counters on your opponent. And then Porcelain Zealot really works well in this strategy where you're going to have a lot of toxic creatures, because being able to give creatures +2/+2 really boosts them up and helps them get past the defenses. Next up is Blue-Red, which is an oil counters and non-creature spells synergy deck. You have access to a card like Serum Core Chimera, which rewards you whenever you cast a non-creature spell with an oil counter, and then if you can get 3 oil counters, you can remove them from the Serum Core Chimera, draw a card, and then you can discard a non-land card. When you discard the card, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So a really powerful payoff for casting non-creature spells and getting oil counters. Atmosphere Surgeon is another great reward for this exact strategy. You can start giving your creatures flying with those oil counters, and then Urabrask's Anointer really rewards you for having a lot of permanents with oil counters on them, because it's going to come into play and be able to kill a creature and deal X damage, where X is the number of permanents with oil counters on them. Next is Green-Black, which is a poison victory deck. So this isn't just a deck that tries to get a couple of poison counters on here or there. It really wants to finish the job and get your opponent to 10 poison. It has Necrogen Rot Priest as a great 4-drop for the deck that has Toxic 2, and whenever a creature with Toxic deals damage, they get an additional poison counter. So really rewards you for having a lot of toxic creatures, and you can even give toxic creatures Death Touch, so that's really powerful. Nimrazor Paladin is another toxic creature that's going to come in with some value as well. And then Paladin of Predation is a large creature that also has Toxic 6, so it's going to be able to finish the game when it does hit your opponent, and it even has a little bit of evasion to boot. Next up is Blue-White, which is an artifacts-themed deck. You have access to a card like Cephalopod Sentry, which is a 4-mana star 5 flyer, where star is equal to the number of artifacts you control. You have access to Unctus's Retrofitter, which can turn one of your artifacts into an artifact creature with power and toughness 4/4. And then you have Plated Onslaught, which is a mass pump spell that's going to cost less for the number of artifacts you control. It's worth noting that there are quite a few cards in this set that generate 1/1 might creature tokens, and those are artifacts, so they will fit nicely into this deck. Moving on to Red-Green, this is a mid-range oil counters deck. You have Cinder/Ravager, which is a big 5/5 vigilance creature that deals damage to each creature your opponents control when it comes into play, and also costs less for each permanent you control with an oil counter on it. You also have Evolving Adaptive as an efficient 1-drop that's going to grow over the course of the game and fuel your oil synergies. And then you have Magmatic Sprinter, which is not only a nice haste creature when you need one, but also can just be used as a way to continually put oil counters onto your various cards that care about them. Next up is Black-White, which is a deck that cares about Corrupted. It doesn't necessarily need to kill the opponent with poison counters, but it does want to get at least 3 counters onto the opponent. When it does, it gets a lot of great payoffs. Vivisection Evangelist is a sweet 2-for-1 if you are able to get that Corrupted enabled, and Apostle of Invasion turns into an absolute beater of a flyer if you are able to get Corrupted. You can start getting Corrupted triggered as early as turn 2 by playing a turn 1 Bilious Skull Welder, which is a 1/1 Death Touch that has Toxic 1, so that's a nice enabler for this strategy. Next, we're going to be talking about Blue-Green, which is a Proliferate and Poison deck. It can use a card like Tainted Observer, which is a flyer with Toxic 1 to get some poison onto the opponent, and then it can use a bunch of proliferate cards like Serum Snare to slowly tick that poison counter up until it gets to that magical 10. In the process, you can play cards like Viral Spawning and flash it back thanks to Corrupted and things of that nature. So play some cards that care about counters, especially poison, and then proliferate and profit. The final archetype is Black-Red, which is a deck that cares about oil counters and sacrifice. You gain access to Char Forger, which is not only a 2/3 and a 1/1 for just 3 mana, but also gives you some card advantage as your creatures die. You also gain access to Necrosquito, which is a nice 4-drop flyer that grows as your other creatures go to the graveyard, and then you also get Exuberant Fuseling, which is a 1-drop that's going to get bigger as your creatures die as well. Moving on to the combat tricks, these are all of the cards you need to be aware of that exist at common. In white, there's Zealot's Conviction and Complete Devotion. In blue, there is Aspirant's Ascent. In black, there is Whisper of the Dross and Offer Immortality. In red, there is Free from Flesh and Blazing Crescendo. And in green, there is Titanic Growth and Maze's Mantle. So if your opponent makes a suspicious attack, these are the cards that you should immediately be thinking of. Looking at some traps to avoid, up first is Duress. This is a card that's generally not worth main decking in Limited because there are going to be a decent number of times where you just completely whiff and your opponent has no non-creatures in their hand, and it's also a miserable top deck in the late game. Just because it's playable in the sideboards of constructed decks does not mean it is a great Limited card. Next is Veil of Assimilation, which looks like it would be a card for your Artifact Synergy decks, but the problem is that it doesn't really help you if you fall behind, and it just doesn't do enough to justify its spot in your deck. Finally, Font of Progress is a trap because it seems to imply that there is a mill strategy in the format, which there simply isn't. Font of Progress and the mythic rare Jace are the only cards that care about milling your opponents, so if you see a Font of Progress early, don't take it because you will not find support for it. Up next is the combos section, where I'm going to be discussing combos you can assemble with commons and uncommons in the set. The first one is a classic, steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it. Awaken the Sleeper lets you gain control of target creature until end of turn, so you can steal your opponent's best threat, hit them with it, and then sacrifice that creature to a card like Cutthroat Centurion so that you never have to give it back. The next combo is between Against All Odds and Meldweb Curator. Essentially, you can cast Against All Odds to exile the Meldweb Curator, and then when Meldweb Curator comes back into play, you can use its ability to put Against All Odds back on top of your deck. This normally wouldn't accomplish anything, but Against All Odds has a second line that lets you return target artifact or creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield when you do this, which means that you are able to slowly bring back all of your small creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield if you are in a situation where that would be optimal. The next combo is between Gleeful Demolition and Phyrexian Mites, which are in fact artifact tokens, which means that you can cast Gleeful Demolition to kill your own Phyrexian Mite token and replace it with 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, which is nice because turning 1/1/1 into 3 1/1s is quite nice, and Phyrexian Mites are everywhere. The final combo is between Churning Reservoir and Incubation Sac. Essentially, Churning Reservoir lets you put an oil counter onto another target non-token artifact or creature you control, which means that every upkeep you can put a counter onto your Incubation Sac, and then every turn you can use your Incubation Sac to get a 3/3 token and never run out of oil counters as long as the Churning Reservoir is fueling it, which is a really nice combo. Moving on to the mana fixing, we have at common Terramorphic Expanse, which is quite powerful as a way to enable fixing from the land slot, and also Prophetic Prism, which is a great artifact for fixing your mana. These two cards alone mean that splashing is definitely going to be an option in this set because they are historically some of the best ways to do so. Dune Mover is a bit weaker as an option and really should only be a last resort as a splash enabler, but it can definitely do the job in a pinch. Phyrexian Atlas costs 3 mana, so it's not ideal, but it can also be used to help fix your mana. If you are playing green, Thirsting Roots is also an option for mana fixing. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is to prioritize the Sphere lands. They are a simple way to prevent mana flood. So a card like the Autonomous Furnace, which it comes into play tapped, can tap for a red mana and then pay 1 on a red, tap and sacrifice it to draw a card, is quite nice. There is a whole cycle of these, 1 for each color, and they are cards that you should prioritize over replacement level cards for your deck, because if you get to the late game, it's going to be great to have them as an option. And my final tip is Proliferate gives the poison win condition quite a bit of reach, so be careful. Because that Proliferate is a mechanic in this set, there are quite a few ways to give your opponent poison counters without actually using combat. So just because you have the board stabilized doesn't mean that your opponent is not going to be able to add to your poison count. So once you are in a commanding position, make sure you end the game quickly. And if you do have the option, try to keep your poison count low, because there are quite a few ways to add to it without needing to attack. So that's just something to be aware of. That is going to do it for this draft guide. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave #draftwillbe1 in the comments section, because you're now ready to crush your next draft. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.